This is the Equatorial Broadcast. I'm Michael Arden. It's Monday, March 2nd, 2026. Joining me is Claire Whitfield. Today, we examine a conceptual framework that draws together insights from psychology, neuroscience, and Christian spiritual teaching. It centers on what is described as a brief interval between inner impulse and outward action, a moment some refer to as the gap. The framework is not an established doctrine or formal school of thought. Instead, it is presented as a synthesis of existing observations, that human beings experience automatic impulses, that regulation is possible, and that biblical texts consistently link moral responsibility to how a person responds under pressure.
Michael, the idea that there is a space between stimulus and response is not new. It appears in modern psychology and in 20th century existential thought. What this framework attempts to do is bring that insight into closer conversation with biblical language about self-control and what Christians describe as walking by the Spirit.
That integration is what we're exploring today. Reporting on how this model is structured and how it relates to both clinical research and Scripture is our religion and ethics correspondent, Thomas Avery.
Reporting from New York, Thomas Avery. The GAP framework begins with a premise that appears across several disciplines, that there is a brief, discernible interval between what happens to a person and how that person responds. Viktor Frankl, the 20th century psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, is widely credited with writing that between stimulus and response there is a space, and that within that space lies the possibility of choice. Cognitive behavioral therapy, as described in clinical literature, teaches that automatic thoughts and emotional reactions can be identified and interrupted before they translate into behavior. Research in affective neuroscience indicates that emotional processing often precedes conscious awareness, but that executive regulatory systems can slow or modulate how those impulses are expressed. At its core, the GAP framework attempts to formalize this shared insight, that what a person does in that brief interval may shape outcomes more decisively than the trigger itself. The model organizes this process into 4 stages: trigger, impulse, pause, and response. The trigger may be external, such as a raised voice, a slammed door, or a sudden disruption. It may also be internal, such as a memory, a worry, or a physical sensation. The impulse is the immediate emotional and physiological surge that follows, a flash of anger, a wave of fear, or a pull toward withdrawal. Within the framework, that surge is understood as automatic rather than deliberate. The third stage, the pause, is the focal point. Even when brief, this pause is described as the moment in which awareness can interrupt momentum. The response that follows becomes the observable behavior that others experience. Some Christian theologians and pastoral scholars who have engaged comparable ideas connect this structure to familiar biblical texts. In the New Testament letter to the Galatians, the Apostle Paul urges believers to walk by the Spirit rather than gratify what he calls the desires of the flesh, describing an internal tension between those influences. In the letter of James, temptation is portrayed as preceding sin, which emerges when desire has conceived and gives birth to action. Some Christian interpreters suggest that this pause corresponds to the moment when a person chooses whether to walk by the Spirit or to act on impulse. Other passages reinforce the theme of delay and regulation. James instructs believers to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Proverbs praises the one who is slow to anger and who rules his spirit. Scholars of biblical ethics note that these texts assume a moment in which speech and reaction can be governed before they are fully expressed. In practical terms, proponents often describe domestic settings. In a crowded home, a parent may feel irritation when children argue or disregard instructions. The physiological surge is immediate. Within this model, the decisive point is not the emotion itself, but the fraction of a second before words are spoken or actions are taken. Family therapists report that when an adult deliberately slows breathing, lowers vocal intensity, and pauses before responding, the emotional climate of a room often shifts. Research on emotional co-regulation suggests that one person's steadier nervous system can influence others who are in a heightened state. Within Christian teaching, this dynamic is sometimes associated with the exhortation to let the peace of Christ rule in the heart, with the expectation that such peace will manifest in tone and presence as well as belief. The framework also addresses what happens when people do not pause in time. It acknowledges that reactions frequently occur before awareness fully engages. To account for that, it identifies what it describes as a secondary pause, a moment after a sharp word or impulsive act, when recognition arises and a person becomes aware that their response did not align with their values. At that point, there is another decision, whether to justify the behavior or to repair it. In pastoral counseling practice, repair is often approached in structured terms. Individuals are encouraged to acknowledge their behavior clearly, avoid shifting blame, name the specific action that caused harm, and restate the standard they intended to uphold. This approach aligns with biblical themes of confession and reconciliation, including passages that urge believers to admit wrongdoing and seek restored relationship. Over time, supporters of the framework suggest that repeated use of the pause, both before reaction and after misstep, contributes to what Christian theology calls sanctification and what psychology describes as character development. They often reference Paul's statement in the letter to the Romans that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. In this reading, the daily discipline of delaying reaction under stress becomes a modest but cumulative form of endurance that reshapes habitual responses. Clinical and theological commentators alike caution against misusing the concept. They note that a pause can become avoidance, where necessary decisions are indefinitely delayed. It can become suppression, where emotion is denied rather than acknowledged. It can even become a performance of calm designed to intimidate or control. In those cases, they argue, the language of the gap ceases to promote responsibility and instead protects image. For those who advocate the framework, its value lies in disciplined self-governance. It is described as most effective when it leads to quieter speech, timely repair, and a consistent willingness to take responsibility for one's own conduct regardless of how others respond. In summary, the GAP framework represents a theoretical synthesis. It integrates established psychological insights about stimulus and response, research on nervous system regulation, and long-standing biblical calls to measured speech and self-control. Its central claim is that the brief interval before action carries significant moral and relational weight, and that learning to use that interval deliberately may alter the course of everyday conflict. For the Equatorial Broadcast, I'm Thomas Avery.
Thomas, thank you.
While the terminology may be recent, the concern it addresses, how individuals govern speech and action under pressure, has deep roots in both psychological research and biblical ethics. The terminology may change, but the core concern remains the same.
Claire, thank you. The Equatorial Broadcast is produced with support from Khao Sai Amazon Jungle Lodge, with guided rainforest expeditions operated by Khao Sai Amazon Jungle Tours in Peru. For the Equatorial Broadcast, I'm Michael Arden.